Hi, thank you for checking out this presentation. Before we begin, a couple of notes. A few years ago, while digging into some family genealogy, I learned about a time from our nation's past that involved some truly heroic people who were struggling to navigate a particularly difficult period during our nation's expansion. And what struck me is that the footprint of the crisis that unfolded during the time before the Civil War can be seen in the struggles of our current generation. And some of the issues that we thought were done and settled, in fact, have never been fully resolved, and in many ways are just as prevalent as they were almost 2 centuries ago. The story of that time and those people inspired me to learn more, and I hope this presentation does the same for you. So with that, please come with me to visit a time and a place when entire communities rose up to protect their neighbors. A time when unjust mandates by the federal government were forcefully resisted by people who surrounded their neighbors and did everything in their power to shield them from harm. Hour after hour, day and night, the menacing threats rained down on William and Catherine Harris as they huddled together with their 3-year-old daughter, shivering with fear in the hold of the canal boat. 2 passengers, Jeremiah Clooney and Silas Cowles, thought it would be fun to harass the black family who were trying to get to Canada along the Erie Canal. Canada meant freedom for the Harrises because overnight their world had changed and they were afraid. Their fellow passengers sensed this fear and blasted cruel remarks from the deck. "We don't have much money now, but in Syracuse we'll get plenty for these ones." These tormentors knew they could be heard, and when they weren't making indirect threats, they gleefully taunted their fellow passengers right to their faces. "The kidnappers are coming, probably next stop, or the one after. They'll take your head off if you fight." Now, Cowles and Clooney wouldn't let up, because this was fun for them. It didn't matter that Catherine was a free woman from Philadelphia, where she was born and raised, or that her husband of 7 years, a former slave, was a well-respected mason and cobbler in their home city. Their skin color made them a target, and a new law terrified them so much that they left family, friends, and jobs to begin life anew in Canada. The couple had made an agreement. They promised they would kill themselves rather than be thrown into chains and dragged to slavery. With every sadistic taunt from the fellow travelers, Catherine and William's terror grew until finally it reached a breaking point. In the darkness of night, Clooney and Cowles staged a cruel prank. They banged around on the deck above, pretending that slave catchers had come aboard. They yelled out frightened cries of "Murder!" and "Oh Lord!" Terrified, Catherine turned to her husband and said, "They're coming for us. I'm going overboard." William said he would follow her or take his life in some other way. Catherine grabbed her daughter. She leaped through the window of the boat into the cold October waters of the canal. Thrashing about, unable to swim, she immediately lost hold of her daughter. Passengers pulled Catherine out, but the child's body was left to the canal, never to be found. After tending to his wife, William went back up to the deck where Clooney threatened to cut his throat. The couple were in full panic mode, not to mention the overwhelming grief that they felt with the loss of their child. They begged the crew for help, but all they got were more threats, even from the captain who said the slave hunters would come at 10 o'clock that night. As the minutes and hours ticked by, the Harris' anxiety rose to unbearable levels. And as promised, at 10 o'clock, Clooney burst into the couple's berth, let out a sinister laugh, and said to William, "The crew will be here presently to take off your head." Well, William was defiant. He said he'd rather slit his own neck than give anyone else that pleasure. And with that, he drew a knife across his throat, drawing blood. Catherine, of course, cried for help. Nobody came. Her husband had injured himself, but not enough to die right away. So as he laid on the floor, writhing in pain, his fellow passengers, they just mocked him for not doing the job right. They played a game of cards, like the man's agony was nothing. Morning came as the canal boat passed through Utica, but the crew would not get medical aid for William. Later, thinking he was just dead weight, they dumped him overboard and onto the canal path. For 20 miles, gravely injured and weak, William followed the horses that pulled the boat along the path. He staggered along, pleading to be led on board. His cries were ignored until finally he collapsed, and the boat continued on. Luckily, another boat captain on the canal found William and got him to Syracuse, where a physician tended to his injuries. Eventually, the Harrises reunited and also received some justice. Their tormentors were brought to trial, and the most egregious offender went to jail. The year was 1850. The sectional tensions between the North and South were coming to a boil. The Harris family were among the first of many thousands to flee their homes after President Millard Fillmore signed the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, this was a law that was passed by the federal government as part of an arrangement designed to hold the North and South together amidst the expansion of the United States. Think of the time period and what was at stake. The Mexican-American War, it had just recently ended. And this led to the United States gaining a large amount of new territory. In fact, the country nearly doubled in size after the war. The question then was whether slavery would be allowed in those new areas. Now, this caused friction between the North, which opposed the spread of slavery, and the South, which wanted to expand it. Now, I am grossly oversimplifying things here, but here's the gist. In an attempt to ease the North and South tension, the Compromise of 1850 was created. As part of that deal, California entered the Union as a free state, but to appease the South, a stricter Fugitive Slave Act was passed. Now, the original law had been in the books for more than 50 years, but this new law was different. It was tougher. It required people in free states to help capture and return runaway enslaved people, even if they had escaped to states where slavery was illegal. This compromise tried to balance the interests of both sides, but ultimately it deepened the divide between the North and South, and this added to the conflicts that burst into the Civil War. But this fugitive slave law, why did it make people like the Harrises take flight, leaving everything and everyone they knew behind? After all, laws are meant to protect us, right? Well, this law was different, and anti-slavery people everywhere condemned it immediately, calling it all kinds of names. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was different in that it essentially forced every citizen, you, and me, to assist in the capture and return to slavery any fugitives, like Catherine and William Harris, who might cross our path. So, if you refused to help, if you got in the way of anyone attempting to catch one, if you provided safe haven for a runaway slave, you could get fined today's equivalent of $40,000 and spend 6 months in jail. Slave catchers were authorized to capture alleged fugitive slaves and return them to their owners. And by the way, no one was really keeping tabs on what they were doing. Slave catchers could even request the assistance of federal marshals or other officials to help them grab a runaway. This happened. It happened a lot. Well, you might think the slaves should have some due process, right? Like a jury trial? Nope. If you were caught, you'd be sent up to a federally appointed local commissioner to determine your fate. No trial for you. Often slave catchers didn't even have to give proof as to who owned you, such as a bill of sale. If they just showed up with a piece of paper and they claimed ownership of an escaped enslaved person, usually that was enough. Now, the commissioners were rewarded for this effort, and quite handsomely, especially if the slave was sent back to their so-called master. For every slave a commissioner sent back to bondage, the commissioner got $10, or about $400 today. If a commissioner set the captive free, or if, in other words, ruled against the slaveholder, he'd only get half that amount. Either way, the commissioner got paid. This law, what a law. Think of the position it put people in. Everyone was legally bound to be an enforcer. You might have to arrest your neighbor, or someone you knew from church. If you were black, your life became more hellish the day the bill was signed. Even if you were a runaway slave who'd been living and working in a sanctuary city for many years, even if you had paid for your emancipation, even if you were born free, all bets were off now. Anyone could be snatched up and sent down the river. And, tragically, a great many were. Now, imagine the Harris family, hardworking people living in a large city where slavery was illegal. Catherine, born free. William, a runaway, living in what he thought was a safe place. Both of them respected in their community, talented at their craft. But Philadelphia freedom did not exist for the Harrises after the Fugitive Slave Law was passed. They had to run, terrified, to another country where they knew not a soul. And so they fled, only to be harassed, harangued, subjected to horrific psychological torture that led to the loss of their child. Shame on those who stole their life, stole their happiness. Shame on them. Communities in the North were understandably mortified by the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law, and many of them sprang into action to protect their neighbors and those passing through their cities and towns on their way to freedom. These communities passed personal liberty laws, offering legal protections to black people and sometimes nullifying parts of the federal law. A movement took hold to protect the hunted from the hunters. By 1850, one northern city in particular was known as a hotbed of abolitionist activity: Syracuse, New York. Syracuse's position along the Erie Canal made it an ideal location for fugitives traveling north toward Canada. Anyone coming through Syracuse, ultimately seeking freedom, would not only receive a warm welcome, they would be supported by a robust network of abolitionists, religious leaders, political leaders, business people, all of them outspoken activists who resisted pro-slavery laws. Now, despite the passage of the bill, Syracuse residents actively rejected enforcing the Fugitive Slave Law. They often defied federal authorities in aiding fugitives in escaping arrest. Syracuse frequently hosted conventions for the New York State Anti-Slavery Society, as well as the Liberty Party Convention, both of which gathered abolitionist leaders and activists to discuss strategies for ending slavery. Now, the federal government knew all about this. It was well aware of the city's renegade and illegal defense of fugitives. Syracuse was reviled by the South for its protection of slaves. Washington, D.C. was none too pleased either. In fact, the Secretary of State, Daniel Webster, yes, that Daniel Webster, made a trip to the city and gave a speech, shaking his fist, threatening the citizens to uphold the Fugitive Slave Act. Anything less would be treason, he shouted. As we will hear shortly, when put to the test, the community would defy his demands, forcefully and aggressively. When the Fugitive Slave Act was signed, abolitionists in the city, black and white, sprang into action. They formed a vigilance committee, which created resolutions designed to reject the law. They said the bill was a license for kidnapping under the protection and at the expense of our federal government, which has become the tool of oppressors. With powerful language and impassioned pleas from civic, religious, and business leaders throughout the city, Syracuse stood strong against what it saw as a particularly cruel and unjust federal mandate. They told the bullies to stay away. They were not welcome in their city, and the city would fight them if they came. A Vigilance Committee meeting convened at Syracuse Market Hall on October 12, 1850, just weeks after the passage of the bill. At that time, a member of the community took the stage and made a speech defending the liberty of a runaway slave who had been a member of the community for 9 years. The man he stood up for was anyone but the typical fugitive passing through on his way to Canada. In fact, his name was Reverend Jermain Wesley Loguen, and he was the superintendent of the Underground Railroad in Syracuse. Loguen was also a runaway slave himself. His story, which I will outline in a moment, is incredible. But first, let's hear the powerful words of one of his friends in Syracuse, Charles B. Sedgwick, the attorney, judge, and later on, a member of the United States House of Representatives. Sedgwick and others made powerful, persuasive speeches to encourage the attendees to vote for adopting the resolutions to protect fugitives living in and passing through Syracuse. Here's a 2-minute excerpt from what Sedgwick said to the Vigilance Committee about how he intended to protect his friend, neighbor, and brother in the abolitionist movement.
A man, no, a dog, may come here scenting blood on the track of our brother Loguen. Shall we let him drag him off to slavery again? No, never. Loguen has been driven and stricken from childhood to manhood. He has been literally a man of sorrows. His soul was trodden on by oppression. But he rose in the might of his manhood and made his way across rivers, through swamps, over mountains, to our city, and declared that he was a man. He is here among us, a resident of our city, and it shall be a place of safety to him. We will not give him up. He is a husband and a father on our free soil. And will you give him back to the hell of slavery? What will you do, men of Syracuse, with this fugitive? Will you lay your hands upon him? Will you suffer him to be dragged back to bondage? No, never. We are citizens of a free state, and this law, this fugitive slave law passed by Congress, seeks to make us accomplices in this iniquity. But I say here tonight, it is not the law of this city, it is not the law of this state, and it shall not be the law of this people. We will not bow our heads to such tyranny, nor will we allow one of our citizens to be made a victim of it. Our city will be the city of refuge for all who seek it. This is our duty as men, as Christians, and as citizens of Syracuse. Jermain Loguen has endured more than any of us can imagine, and now that he has found his freedom, it is our responsibility to ensure that he never loses it again. Let it be known, this law will find no support here, and neither will those who come to enforce it.
Sedgwick's words are powerful, especially when you consider the man he was speaking about and pleading for his neighbors to protect, Jermain Loguen. By that time, Loguen was a famous abolitionist and a freedom fighter, working alongside Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, Gerrit Smith, Harriet Tubman, and more. Loguen was a minister, a teacher. He toured the country, delivering powerful speeches against slavery. Most notably, he and his wife Caroline opened their doors to runaway slaves any time of day and night, clothing them, feeding them, giving them a chance to rest and refresh before helping them find their way to freedom. Loguen did this in open defiance of the law and at constant risk of arrest or even a return to slavery. Logan's life story could fill a book. In fact, it has, in the form of his slave narrative. But even a cursory sketch of his life reveals a man of uncommon resilience, strength, determination, and unshakable courage. I will summarize the key facts of this man's life, and I'm sorry for leaving out all of the hundreds of details that form a more accurate picture of Jermain Loguen and how he became the man he was. Defying all odds and set against the backdrop of violence and cruelty, Loguen nevertheless built a most amazing and accomplished life. He was able to shake off the shackles of slavery and literally create a name for himself. Jermain Loguen was not his birth name. His birth name came from his father, who was also his mother's owner. His story began in Tennessee, not far from Nashville, in 1813, a place called Mansker Creek. His name was Jermain Loguen. They called him Jarm. His mother, Jane, later known as Cherry, was born free in Ohio. But at age 7, she was kidnapped and taken across the Ohio River to Kentucky, and then on to Tennessee, where she was sold below market price to the Loguen family. These people were in the business of making whiskey. So Cherry grew up with that family. She became a strong and indispensable help in the house, the fields, and in the distillery. She also endured physical violence and sexual abuse at the hands of her masters. Now, it's been well documented that many slaves were victims of sexual exploitation. And this was certainly the case of Cherry, who bore 4 children by the youngest son of her slave owner. Jarm Loguen was the second of those 4 children. Although Jarm's mother was physically strong and emotionally tough, Jarm witnessed countless scenes of her being whipped, paddled, chained to her weaving loom. He also saw how Cherry responded to the inhumane treatment that she received. Her owners, well, they wanted her to be docile. They wanted her to be submissive. But instead, Jarm watched her only become more angry and defiant. And these were traits that the boy would carry with him into manhood. Now, life at the distillery in Tennessee was brutal. And the fact that the family of slaves was overseen by uneducated people with easy access to limitless amounts of alcohol made it especially hard on all of them. As a boy, Jarm witnessed his friend Sam, a slave from a nearby farm, suffer torture at the end of a slave paddle, after which he was roped to a whiskey barrel, rolled down a hill into a creek where he perished. When drink got the best of his slaveholder father, he sold Jarm, his mother, and siblings to his brother in another town. And there, the beatings and the abuse got even worse. Later, young Jarm watched his mother try to fight off slave merchants as they ripped two of her youngest children from her arms and carried them off, never to be seen again. One day, while working in the fields, his master, drunk on whiskey, flew into a rage, pinning Jarm to the dirt and driving the wedge of a hoe into his mouth. This injury most likely caused a speech impediment that he would struggle with for the rest of his life. The man who brutalized him, you might remember, the man who brutalized him was not just Jarm's owner, he was his biological uncle. So finally, at about age 21, and after a lifetime under whips and chains, Jarm Logue became determined to choose his own fate. He teamed up with a slave who lived on a nearby farm named John Farney, and the two men worked out a plan for how they would get away. Over several months, Jarm and John gathered up the resources they needed to make their escape. They bartered with a man who liked whiskey. In exchange, they received guns, ammunition, and forged passes. And on Christmas Eve, 1834, Jarm stole his master's finest horse and took off, with his friend, following the drinking gourd toward the North Star. Jarm and John endured brutal weather. They got lost in blinding snow, they forded icy rivers, they became disoriented and delayed by poorly marked trails and roads they couldn't travel by day. They encountered and fought slave catchers. They were taken in by Quakers, indigenous American Indians, sympathetic white families, black activists, good Samaritans. They slept on hay bales, in drafty barns, hungry, tired, top eye open. The journey was long and grueling, but they finally made it to Michigan, then crossed the frozen Detroit River, parting ways at the Canadian border. Here is where Jarm Logue became his own man and changed his name to Jermain Wesley Loguen. Jermain found work in Canada, then in Rochester, where he saved his money working in a hotel. He learned to read and write. He earned his way into studies at the Oneida Institute in Whitesboro, New York. Then he opened schools for black children in small cities across New York State. He was Utica's first African-American teacher. He also became a minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, and he preached around central New York. Jermain Loguen, now his own man, worked diligently to make a purposeful life for himself. And he kept going, eager to make the world better for those suffering under the curse of slavery. Jermain married a biracial, free, and educated abolitionist from Western New York named Caroline Storham. After settling in Syracuse and establishing a family, Jermain and Caroline soon began their mission to help as many fugitive slaves find their way to freedom as they could possibly manage. And here's what I find so remarkable, so brave, and so brazen about how Jermain Loguen lived his life. For one, unlike many former slaves who found refuge in free states, Loguen rejected the idea of paying for his own freedom, or for anyone else buying him out of bondage. He even turned down offers to have his mother ransomed from slavery in Tennessee. Loguen believed such a transaction was immoral, because who was he in the eyes of God other than a free man from his first day of birth? He also felt that paying money for freedom only tempered the chains of slavery and reinforced the South's right to buy and sell human beings. This was a bargain he refused to make for the rest of his life. And here's another interesting fact about Loguen and the Underground Railroad operations in Syracuse. There was nothing secret. There was nothing underground about it. Loguen frequently posted notices in the Syracuse newspaper welcoming fugitives to stay at his depot. He basically gave them the middle finger to anyone daring to come to Syracuse to stop him from doing his part to free the slaves. Jermain and Caroline were proud abolitionists, and they openly mocked the laws that put bloodhounds on the trail of fugitives. They even published their address on handbills and in all the advertisements, 293 East Genesee Street. It was as if to say, If you're running from slavery, here's a place to rest and refuel. We'll get you straight. We'll send you to the next station. And anyone who has a problem with that, well, just try to stop us and see what happens. Bullies are not welcome here. So let's return to the good people of Syracuse and the Vigilance Committee meeting that took place soon after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law. Earlier, we heard a respected member of the community plead with his neighbors to protect one of their own, Jermain Loguen. Now let's hear from Loguen himself, whose words, according to one observer, uncapped the volcano of resistance to the Fugitive Slave Law among the people of Syracuse.
I was a slave. I knew the dangers I was exposed to. I had made up my mind as the course I was to take. What is life to me if I am to be a slave in Tennessee? My neighbors, I have lived with you many years, and you know me. My home is here, and my children were born here. I am bound to Syracuse. And do you think I can be taken away from you and from my wife and children and be a slave in Tennessee?
No!
I tell you, the people of Syracuse and of the whole North must meet this tyranny and crush it by force, or be crushed by it. Whatever may be your decision, my ground is taken. I have declared it everywhere. It is known over the state and out of the state, over the line in the North and over the line in the South. I don't respect this law. I don't fear it. I won't obey it. It outlaws me, and I outlaw it, and the men who attempt to enforce it on me. I place the governmental officials on the ground that they place me. I will not live a slave, and if force is employed to re-enslave me, I shall make preparations to meet the crisis as becomes a man. I say, if you will stand with us in resistance to this measure, you will be the saviors of your country. Your decision tonight in favor of resistance will give vent to the spirit of liberty, and it will break the bands of party and shout for joy all over the earth. Heaven knows that this act of noble daring will break out somewhere, and may God grant that Syracuse be the honored spot whence it shall send an earthquake voice through the land.
The pieces were in place. Something big was going to happen, and it would happen in Syracuse. You had families on the run, their flight made more urgent by an infernal law. You had a former slave turned superintendent of the Underground Railroad. You had a community that promised to protect its people and those fleeing slavery. And you had a federal government determined to put its foot down to crush the spirit of a sanctuary city. These were the ingredients that culminated in an eruption in Syracuse on October 1st, 1851, of what is known as the Jerry Rescue. On that first day of October, Syracuse was bustling with visitors. There was a huge turnout for the Onondaga County Agricultural Fair. Also in the city was a Liberty Party convention filled with fervent abolitionists. It was inside this charged atmosphere that the news spread. A fugitive slave known as Jerry had been arrested. Jerry, whose real name was William Henry, was well known and well liked in the community, and he had been working as a barrel maker. Jerry had escaped bondage in Missouri and had been living in Syracuse for years. Now he was under arrest. Slave catchers and federal marshals had come for him. As the carriages carrying Jerry and the marshals approached the police office, word of his arrest ignited the abolitionists. Charles A. Wheaton, a prominent businessman, interrupted the convention to announce the arrest, and this prompted the abolitionists to break up, sound the alarm. They had planned for all of this. They knew what to do, and they knew what the citizens of the city were going to do as well. Vigilance Committee members rang the bell of the Presbyterian Church. This was a signal. Within minutes, as if on cue, church bells were ringing everywhere, the signal that slave catchers were in the city. Almost immediately, crowds began to charge towards the commissioner's office downtown. Inside, the hearing had begun with a neighbor of Jerry's owner in Missouri testifying against the fugitive slave. Defense attorneys stepped in for Jerry, but the commissioner dismissed their objections. Realizing he'd been found guilty, Jerry attempted a desperate escape with the help of a sympathetic spectator. He charged out of the courtroom. Throngs of city folk cheered as Jerry raced through the streets. Unfortunately, he was quickly recaptured, he was beaten, he was thrown on a cart and hauled back to the hearing. Now at this point, the crowd outside was now numbering in the thousands, and they were getting very furious. Syracuse abolitionist leaders, including Reverend Samuel Joseph May, urged everyone to be patient. He told everyone in the crowd to wait until nightfall for a rescue attempt. Meanwhile, the Vigilance Committee convened to plan Jerry's release. They decided that a forceful rescue would make a powerful statement against the fugitive slave law and demonstrate the strength of public opinion against slavery. The hearing resumed as darkness began to fall. The crowd outside continued to swell, becoming more restless, more aggressive. When the court adjourned for the evening, the Vigilance Committee sprang into action. Armed with clubs, axes, and iron rods, the throng began assaulting the building. The militia, who were originally called to disperse the crowd, they were persuaded not to get into it, and this left the marshals vastly outnumbered. The mob smashed the windows, smashed the doors of the commissioner's office, and in the chaos, the marshals were overwhelmed. Someone cut the gas lines. Everything went dark. Seizing the moment, a frightened guard pushed Jerry out of the room, where he was quickly spirited away by the rescuers. Instead of fleeing immediately, Jerry's rescuers boldly drove him around town to have his shackles removed at a blacksmith shop. Then they hid him at one of the last places you would look, in the home of a man who was one of the city's most vocal critics of the abolitionists, a man who changed his mind when he saw his neighbor thrown in chains. For 4 days, the authorities searched for Jerry, unaware that he was hidden in the anti-abolitionist's home. Finally, Jerry was smuggled out of Syracuse in a butcher's delivery cart. Jerry's journey to freedom continued. He was taken north to a New York town on Lake Ontario. He was then hidden aboard a British schooner in Kingston, Ontario. And once he got to Ontario, he found freedom and began a new life. In gratitude, Jerry sent a letter of thanks to the Syracuse abolitionists, along with a wooden chair that he had made by hand. And in a symbolic gesture, the Vigilance Committee of Syracuse sent President Millard Fillmore a box containing Jerry's shackles, reminding the administration of their defiance and the government's failure to uphold the fugitive slave law. Take that, Daniel Webster. The Harris family, Jermain Wesley Loguen, the brave people of Syracuse. What do these stories teach us? I think they're relevant today in so many ways. But wait, you say, these were struggles from 200 years ago. We have nothing to do with this. Times have changed. People are free. There's no slavery. We're making life too easy and too unfair with all this DEI stuff and talk of reparations. Let's just move on, right? Well, look at it another way. These episodes were not from the Middle Ages. Samuel Joseph May, the Syracuse abolitionist who was central to the Jerry rescue, he was my grandmother's great-grandfather. He spent 50 years of his life railing against the sins of slavery. He was a friend of Jermain Logan's. He was a friend and co-conductor of the Syracuse Underground Railroad. And as a side note, I've been carrying the May name with me all my life. I lived in Syracuse for 6 years while I was in school. Yet it was only recently that I learned about the events that took place there, that the May name carried weight in that city, and that Sam May was a leading light in the fight to end slavery. So history matters. Stories matter, no matter when they come to you. We must remember them, always. So many years later, the fight continues as we cycle through political and social change. Sometimes we see progress. Often those baby steps are followed by backlash. We brag about how much progress has been made. We make proclamations like, we're not going back. We inch forward, and then we reverse course. Back and forth we go in the constant push and pull of what our culture, our politics, and the wealth class decides what is right and fair. When is the next Fugitive Slave Act going to be signed into law? Will each of us be required to be the enforcers of draconian immigration and deportation laws? Will we be threatened with fines and jail time if we link arms to protect family members, neighbors, colleagues, the people who make our food, the people who clean our homes, the people who pick our crops and basically, keep this country running? Could it happen here? Let's not kid ourselves. It's happening already. It's happening right now. So think of the narrative of the 1850s, the culture wars, political turmoil, the powerful people and institutions that were in play back then. Compare that to what we face today, not just with racial injustice, but also reproductive rights, protections for the LGBTQ+ community, immigration laws, voting restrictions, disinformation campaigns, the destruction of our democratic norms in our country today. We're not so different, are we? Now, I know I'm preaching to the choir. You're not watching this to have your mind changed about racism by a guy like me, someone with barely a passing understanding of history, its people, the consequences of the events that came before our time on this planet. I'm just a middle-class white dude living in a liberal state, Massachusetts, in a city with deep abolitionist roots, Boston. I am nothing, but together we are something. My hope is that by learning just a little about some of these people and the communities who shaped history in ways both small and large, that you will be inspired by those who stood strong and who boldly faced off against powerful people and systems of oppression. I hope that later, when it's quiet and you have some time for yourself, maybe close your eyes and think about Catherine and William Harris, their harrowing ordeal, the cruel people who hurt them. Be infuriated. Rail at the injustice of it all. Think about young Jermain Wesley Loguen experiencing terrible pain, violence, heartbreak in Tennessee, how he found freedom in Canada and among friends in New York, and about his devotion to the anti-slavery cause. Maybe think also, as I do often, about the promises made by the people of Syracuse to protect their brothers and sisters, the promise to keep their neighbors safe regardless of the color of their skin, the promise to fight on their behalf, and the will to act on their promise when faced with dire consequences. Share their stories with others if you can, for these are cautionary tales about what can happen when brutish laws are enacted and oppressive forces align to strip us of our freedoms. Decency is not complicated. Being compassionate for our fellow humans is not controversial. Every social pact, every religion, every basic moral code known to humans, for as long as we have been called civilized, all of these things accept that it is wrong to inflict pain and suffering on another human being. So let's be kind. Let's protect each other. And if ever there's a need, tell the bullies to go home, because they are not welcome here. Thank you.